Forget everything you thought you knew about survival. Forget the cozy narratives of history books. This is the moment civilization faced an invisible enemy stronger than any invading army. An enemy that breathed ice and darkness, threatening to extinguish the flame of humanity forever. The Great Chill of 10,000 BCE.
This wasn't just winter. This was a global catastrophe, a cosmic betrayal where the sun itself seemed to shrink, leaving Europe locked in the merciless grip of relentless frost. Can you believe, amidst this epic of frozen terror, that the fate of an entire continent rested on nothing more than curved walls of wattle and daub and a ceiling made of dried grass?
We are plunging back 3,000 years, deep into the primordial forests and wind-swept plains of what would one day be known as Celtic Europe. The air here wasn't just cold, it was malevolent, slicing through skin and bone, promising death to the slow or the exposed. And yet they stood, the guardians of the nascent Bronze Age, the builders of the ultimate survival machine, the Roundhouse. Every single piece of wood, every handful of mud, every strand of tightly bound thatch was a desperate prayer offered up to the gods of warmth. This structure was not merely shelter. It was an audacious act of defiance against the elemental rage of the world. A straight wall would have buckled, offering corners for the wind to tear at, weak points for the spirits of the cold to slip through. But the genius was in the curve, the perfect, unbroken circle, an architectural marvel that forced the gale force winds to simply slide around, leaving the precious, fragile life inside undisturbed. The curvature was a life or death decision made by ancient engineers, a calculation in mud and blood. Imagine the sound, the constant, terrifying shriek of the wind outside, a sound loud enough to drown out thought itself. And then the strange, thick silence inside the earthen walls, broken only by the crackle of fire and the rhythmic, deep breaths of a family clinging to existence. This was the womb against the wilderness. But the heart of the structure, the very engine of survival, was the fire pit, smoldering perpetually at the center. This was the source of life, yes, but it was also the source of the most immediate, terrifying threat. A catastrophe no one saw coming. Every single night was the suffocating embrace of the smoke. They were using fire to survive the cold, but they risked drowning in the fumes just to see the next dawn. This was the ultimate poison they willingly inhaled. There were no chimneys. Think about that sacrifice. Modern homes vent their toxic breath high into the sky, but these people, the architects of our future, had to share their air with the choking, thick gray clouds generated by burning damp timber. The eyes watered constantly, the lungs ached. But this pain was the price of admission to survival. Why? Because that smoke was not waste. It was the second layer of defense. It was the crucial, invisible guardian. As the smoke slowly rose, desperate to escape through the tiny, high opening in the roof apex, the eye of the house, it coated the entire underside of the immense,
conical thatch roof.
This soot, this residue of perpetual combustion, sealed the woven straw and reed, turning a flammable, porous roof into a damp-proof, incredibly insulated cap. Without that smoke coating, the chilling moisture would wick through the thatch, freezing the interior structure and turning the refuge into a tomb. The paradox was brutal. Breathe the smoke or freeze to death. Live with the stinging tears and the burning lungs, or watch the precious warmth bleed out into the hungry night sky. This delicate balance, the perfect amount of smoke that didn't kill the occupants, but solidified the roof structure, was the key to enduring the 1,000-year winter.
It was the secret blueprint, passed down generationally through whispered warnings and ritualized building practices, that kept their small, beating hearts alive while the rest of the wild world turned to ice. We meet Alara, a young woman of the Brigantes tribe, whose entire world was contained within the 9-meter diameter of her family's roundhouse.
Her daily battle wasn't with raiders, not yet, but with the insidious, relentless dampness and the ever-present danger of fire. Every morning she woke up to the pervasive smell of wood smoke and the persistent fear that a single spark, escaping the low-hanging smoke column, might ignite the dry, brittle thatch just inches above her sleeping head. Fire, the gift of the gods, was also the ultimate executioner, waiting for one moment of carelessness, one dry gust of wind, to turn the sanctuary into a roaring inferno. The community depended entirely on her father, Cillian, the house builder, who possessed the arcane knowledge of how to pack the clay and dung mix just right, how to weave the roof spars to withstand the weight of a foot of snow, and crucially, how to manage the central hearth. If Cillian misjudged the burn rate, if the wood was too wet, or if the roof developed a tiny, imperceptible leak, but allowed the deadly mix of moisture and cold to penetrate the sealed soot layer, the consequences were immediate and final. The house would fail. The family would perish. This wasn't merely survival. This was a high-stakes gamble against entropy itself, a daily negotiation with the elements where the smallest mistake meant catastrophic failure. We are about to step inside that perfect circle, into the shadows of the Bronze Age, to witness the engineering genius and the terrible cost of life lived under the shadow of the thatch and the tyranny of the smoke. Get ready. This story is just beginning. The thatch. It wasn't just a roof. It was a ticking clock woven from reeds and straw, a massive conical blanket designed to fight the merciless plunging cold of the Iron Age transition that threatened to annihilate every settlement in its path. But surviving the cold required fire, and fire demanded a pact with the devil: smoke. Imagine standing inside that colossal dark space, the temperature outside dropping below freezing, the wind howling like a hungry ghost across the unforgiving plains of ancient Europe. The central hearth, the beating heart of the structure, was the only source of warmth, yet its byproduct, thick, choking wood smoke, was a necessary poison that they ingested nightly just to see the next dawn. The walls themselves, built of intertwined hazel branches, the wattle, then plastered with a dense mixture of clay, mud, and manure, the daub, were surprisingly effective at thermal mass, holding the heat long after the flames died down to embers. But the real genius, the terrifying innovation that allowed them to survive C-1000 BCE, lay in the roof design, that magnificent, highly flammable dome of dried vegetation and structural timber. They didn't want the smoke to escape immediately. In fact, the entire architectural strategy depended on trapping it. They needed it. The smoke was deliberately allowed to rise and become trapped beneath the apex of the huge conical roof, coating the entire underside of the thatch with a layer of heavy soot and creosote. This was the ancient secret of insulation and defense against elemental decay. Fireproofing and waterproofing through deliberate smoke deposition. This dense chemical layer sealed the gaps, repelled moisture, and insulated the dwelling from the great chill far more effectively than any modern synthetic material. But there was an immediate, terrifying trade-off. Every breath they took was costing them precious oxygen, forcing them into a constant, agonizing negotiation with carbon monoxide poisoning, as the thick atmosphere hung suspended just above their heads like a toxic cloud ceiling. Think of the young mother, her eyes streaming from the acrid burn, holding her infant tight, praying to the ancient gods that the draft, the single narrow smoke outlet they sometimes dared to open near the peak, was enough to draw the worst of the fumes away, but not so much that it allowed the hard-won, irreplaceable heat to rush out into the black night. Every morning, the first sound wasn't bird song signaling safety. It was the deep, hacking cough of the entire clan clearing their lungs, a ritualistic clearing of the nightly poisoning before they could begin the day's work. Survival wasn't a given. It was a daily siege, fought against the very air they needed to breathe. The structural framework was terrifyingly simple, yet brutally essential. Massive load-bearing posts, often 4 or 6 of them, sunk deep into the ground, holding the immense, crushing weight of the roof and its snow load. If one of those posts weakened, due to decay, or shifted under the intense pressure, if the thatch ignited, the whole world came down in a flash, burying them under burning debris. And fire was always a heartbeat away from catastrophe. A single stray spark escaping the central stone hearth, a strong, unexpected updraft, or perhaps a moment of exhaustion where a tired soul banked the fire too high before collapsing into sleep. That was all it took for the thermal trap to turn into a self-constructed funeral pyre. The margin for error was non-existent. Yet this smoky, oxygen-deprived hellscape was also their salvation in more ways than just raw warmth. The constant, low-hanging smoke acted as an incredible natural preservative, a vital defense against starvation.
Grains stored meticulously in woven baskets in the rafters, meat hung high above the central fire. The smoke cured and protected everything from scavenging mice, relentless insects, and rapid decay in the damp air.
They lived essentially in a slow-motion, high-stakes smokehouse, an atmosphere that dramatically extended the shelf life of the precious harvest, while simultaneously threatening to shorten the life of the harvester. This was the ultimate, chilling trade-off of the Celtic Bronze Age, preserving the food supply by accepting a constant level of internal toxicity. The builder, the ancient master carpenter who designed this high-wire balancing act, knew the risk intimately. He measured his timbers not just for their immediate strength, but for how well they would resist the constant, drying heat of the fire and the creeping, silent rot that moisture relentlessly brought in from the outside. Every structural post had to be debarked and seasoned perfectly, a massive, silent sentinel against the inevitable threat of collapse. The fate of the entire clan rested on the integrity of those few massive wooden pillars. They survived the night, yes, but the rising sun brought its own cruelties and demands. The Roundhouse kept the bitter cold out, but it also kept the world out, creating a sealed ecosystem where disease and internal conflict could fester and spread just as easily as warmth and community. As the smoke finally began to thin slightly with the rising sun, revealing the soot-streaked faces of the weary inhabitants, they knew the immediate terror of suffocation was over. But the greater fight was just beginning. Because beyond the fragile, smoky walls of the Roundhouse, a different kind of darkness was gathering on the periphery of their world. A darkness carried not by the wind and the smoke, but by the desperate, silent footsteps of neighboring clans who were vying for the exact same diminishing resources under the unrelenting pressure of the Great Chill. The time for isolation and peace was over. The structure that saved them from the climate now had to save them from each other. Get ready for the inevitable collision. It's coming. The collision was not a distant threat. It was the air they breathed, a lethal calculus performed moment by moment in the dim, smoky confines of the Roundhouse. This structure, the geometric marvel that defied the Great Chill, was now the crucible of their sanity. Every breath was a negotiation with death, a payment demanded by the very mechanism that kept the frost from claiming their bones. The central hearth, the beating heart of their world, pushed smoke upward. But there was no chimney, no easy escape. The smoke was trapped beneath the massive, conical roof, a dense, suffocating ceiling that hung just above the heads of the inhabitants, like a perpetually lowering storm cloud. This was the genius and the horror of the Celtic design. That layer of trapped smoke, rich with tar and soot, creosote, was the ultimate insulator. It prevented the precious heat from escaping through the woven thatch and wattle rafters. It sealed the roof against the relentless ingress of damp and cold, turning the structure into a functional, if barely habitable, thermos against the 10,000 BCE winter. It was necessary. It was absolutely, terrifyingly necessary. But the price? The price was measured in lung capacity. It was the constant, stinging assault on their eyes, the relentless headache that became a permanent fixture of life, the low-grade hypoxia that made rational thought an impossible luxury. They were living in a smokehouse, preserving their bodies from the cold by slowly poisoning their minds. The elders, those who had seen perhaps 30 or 40 winters, found sleep increasingly difficult. Every cough was amplified in the resonant circular space, a sound of doom that whispered of failing lungs. The children, huddled low to the ground where the slightly cleaner, cooler air pooled, were shielded, but only barely. This tightrope walk between warmth and suffocation was the daily terror they faced.
And the constant, gnawing threat of fire. Imagine living inside a giant, inverted cone of dried straw and timber, perpetually blackened by highly flammable soot. The thatch was saturated, a perfect, tinder-dry bomb, waiting for a single miscalculation. The fire that saved them was the fire destined to destroy them.
The collision intensified, not with a battle axe, but with dwindling resources. The woodpile, that was the true currency of the Great Chill. In a world where the forest was frozen, and every tree was a monumental effort to fell and transport, the control of fuel became the control of life itself. Who determined which branch fed the flames? Who had the strength to brave the outside to replenish the store? This created the inevitable fissures in the communal structure. The firekeeper, often a physically imposing man tasked with maintaining the sacred flame, suddenly held the ultimate power over everyone's survival. If you angered the firekeeper, perhaps you received damper wood. Perhaps your family was situated closer to the smoky ceiling. Subtle acts of cruelty, magnified tenfold by the suffocating atmosphere and the crushing proximity of 20 or 30 lives jammed together inside that round prison of mud and straw. The societal tension started with whispers, turning into sharp, desperate demands. Give us space. The smoke is thicker over here. Every move was a disruption. Every argument was a threat to the delicate balance of the hearth. They weren't just fighting the cold anymore. They were fighting the profound claustrophobia, the psychological erosion caused by months without privacy, without fresh air, without sunlight. They had retreated completely inward, not just physically into the roundhouse, but psychologically into a state of hypervigilance. Everyone was watching the woodpile. Everyone was watching the roof. And everyone was watching each other, calculating who was consuming too much oxygen, who was demanding too much heat. The very structure that facilitated collective warmth was now forcing a lethal culling. Anthropologists call this the resource stress multiplier. When the environment dictates that not everyone can survive, the niceties of civilization vanish faster than smoke up a chimney, if they had one. But the collision had to be catalyzed by an action. It wasn't enough for the air to be bad. Someone had to make a mistake. And in the ceaseless, dizzying dark, inside the creosote tomb, mistakes were not just possible. They were inevitable. The light inside was poor, relying mostly on the flickering, unreliable glow of the hearth, and perhaps a few oil lamps, shallow vessels filled with animal fat, providing more smoke than illumination. One slip of a hand, one moment of fatigue, and the deadly, dry thatch was within reach of an open flame. Imagine the panic, the instantaneous, gut-wrenching realization that the roof, the great shield protecting them, was now their executioner. Even a small ignition could spread across that soot-caked thatch in seconds, turning the roundhouse into a colossal torch, an instant signal of despair visible for miles across the frozen landscape. They lived under a constant, silent oath, never, under any circumstances, allow the flame to touch the roof. But a young man, weakened by the constant smoke and hunger, stumbled. He was attempting to stack newly delivered kindling near the hearth, his vision blurred, his coordination failing.
His elbow clipped an oil lamp resting precariously on a storage shelf. It didn't shatter. It just tipped, the thick, heavy animal oil sloshing out, instantly finding the dry, compressed reed mats on the floor. A tiny tongue of flame, no bigger than a finger, instantly licked upward toward the wall.
It wasn't the roof, not yet, but it was the terrifying immediate consequence of their collective exhaustion and the lethal design of their sanctuary. The cry went up, a raw, primal sound of terror that cut through the haze of smoke and exhaustion, signifying the true beginning of the internal war. The collision was here, and it was bathed in the red, frightening light of an uncontrolled fire within the heart of the Roundhouse. The blaze was not just heat, it was a hungry, gasping entity, sucking the very oxygen from the closed chamber. Elder Phelan stumbled, his vision blurred not by fear, but by the relentless, acrid smoke that instantly filled the low-ceiling structure. This wasn't the gentle, insulating haze they managed daily. This was a black, suffocating curtain drawn across the face of survival, thick and merciless.
The carefully managed central hearth, the spiritual core of their existence, had erupted. A stray ember, perhaps knocked loose during the deep sleep of the middle watch, had found purchase in the dry kindling stack near the wall, fueled by a disastrous draft. Now the flames licked upward, searching for the ultimate prize, the massive, tightly packed roof of woven reed and heavy straw. They knew the rule. Fire demands air. But in this tomb of woven willow and clay, air was life itself, and every open gap risked letting the great chill rush in and instantly extinguish their tenuous hold on warmth. The smoke hole, the single, pathetic oculus carved into the very peak of the cone, was struggling valiantly to pull the noxious gases upward. But the sheer volume of this inferno overwhelmed it instantly, like a tiny throat trying to swallow a flood. Young Cormac, his face smeared with ash, scrambled towards the only escape valve, the heavy door lashed shut against the murderous, relentless wind outside. Opening it would save them from asphyxiation, a rapid, merciful end to the smoke sickness, but it would invite the biting frost, dropping the internal temperature by lethal degrees in mere moments, freezing the blood in their veins. It was the ultimate, terrifying gamble. Die by slow internal poisoning, or risk instant hypothermia and the subsequent structural collapse caused by rapid temperature shock as the warm, compressed air met the outer ice. Phelan screamed, a choked, terrible sound that managed to cut through the smoke. "Cormac, wait! We must shield the doorway!" Cormac didn't wait entirely, but he understood the terrifying calculus. He wrenched the heavy timber bar free, but instead of swinging the entire door wide, he forced a narrow, agonizing gap, just enough to allow a violent, hissing gust of frigid air to tear through the smoke layer, creating a temporary, terrifying draft.
The sudden influx of oxygen instantly turned the flickering flames into a furious, roaring monster. But it also momentarily cleared the ceiling, allowing the inhabitants a precious, agonizing glimpse of the danger and a few breaths of slightly less toxic air. The cost, however, was searing. That single blast of C-10,000 BCE cold felt like 1,000 needles plunged into exposed skin. They couldn't use water. The water stored in the small ceramic jars was either frozen solid or reserved for drinking, precious beyond measure in this long, brutal winter siege. Their weapon against the fiery beast had to be the earth itself, the very soil they stood upon, damp and cold. They tore at the packed earthen floor near the walls, clawing up handfuls of damp soil and the precious moisture-retaining gob, the mixture of clay, sand, and straw that formed their sturdy internal walls. This was their armor, their extinguisher, their only hope against the raging conflagration. Women and men alike worked in a frantic, coordinated dance of survival, throwing handfuls of mud and earth onto the rapidly spreading flames that threatened to breach the internal wattle and daub partitioning which protected the structural posts. The fire loved the dry thatch bundles used for roof reinforcement near the eaves, leaping toward them like a triumphant, incandescent predator sensing victory. Every second counted. If the fire reached the outer layers of the conical roof, the entire structure, their sole bulwark against the C-1000 BCE climate apocalypse, would vanish in a spectacular column of ash and fire, leaving them utterly exposed to the deadly, relentless, sub-zero European night. They would freeze before the embers cooled. Cormac, having sealed the door again, was now focused on the timber support posts. These were the literal pillars of their life, and the intense heat was already beginning to blacken them, threatening the structural integrity of the entire roof load, which weighed several tons. If they failed, the house would implode. He grabbed a thick, damp piece of cowhide, usually used as a floor covering, and used it like a crude shield, smothering the base of the post, fighting the radiant heat that blistered his exposed hands. The leather hissed and spat, releasing a terrible, oily smoke that momentarily compounded the suffocation, but it bought him time. The genius of the roundhouse design was that the roof was multi-layered. Beneath the thick external thatch, and prevent the fire from spreading instantly upwards into the deep thatch. This barrier was their last line of defense, a thin, charred membrane holding back total incineration. But the intense, localized heat radiating from the uncontrolled hearth was starting to crack it, the wood shrinking and groaning under the fiery pressure. Small plumes of smoke were now visibly curling from the roof structure itself, not just rising to the oculus, a terrifying sign. This meant the fire had moved beyond the floor level. It was tunneling, burrowing into the dry heart of the thatch structure, a silent, creeping menace far more terrifying than the visible flames below. The structural integrity was compromised, even if they smothered the base fire, because the hidden rot was already beginning.
The inhabitants understood this intuitively. The roundhouse was bleeding heat and consuming itself simultaneously. They were trapped inside a living, dying thermal battery, a paradox of comfort and terror built entirely of flammable materials. With a final, desperate shove of wet earth mixed with animal dung, a surprisingly effective fire retardant due to its moisture content, the visible flames near the kindling stack sputtered, choked, and died, leaving behind only fiercely glowing coals and clouds of steam that momentarily intensified the smoke misery. The immediate, localized fire was quelled. The terrifying red glow receded into the darkness.
But the victory was hollow, a temporary reprieve purchased at a ruinous price. The air was now thick with the metallic taste of carbon monoxide, the result of incomplete combustion, and the house, ravaged by the venting of the door, was instantly freezing. The great chill, held at bay for hours by their desperate efforts, rushed in like a vengeful army, dropping the temperature so swiftly that breath turned to crystalline fog mid-air.
They had saved the structure from ignition, preventing the catastrophic flash fire, but they had traded one deadly enemy for another. The core warmth, the carefully cultivated thermal inertia of the Bronze Age home was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of external cold. Now they faced the silent, insidious threat of exposure and the slow, numbing death brought by the C-1000 BCE winter. The true battle for survival was just beginning. They had won the war against fire, only to realize that fire was the only thing standing between them and the crushing, eternal ice outside. The crippled roundhouse stood, a monument to their struggle, leaking heat, smelling of burnt wood and panic, and pooling their precious finite hope into the vast, indifferent dark. The air inside the crippled shelter, the great roundhouse of Bran's lineage, was no longer breathable air. It was a thick, viscous, black blanket, woven from the despair of damp timber and the desperate need for just one more degree of warmth. Every breath was a gamble, a painful extraction of oxygen from a space rapidly being conquered by the silent, invisible killer that was carbon monoxide, born from the very fire they worshipped. The chilling reality of the Bronze Age was this: you could not escape the cold without inviting death by smoke. The fire pit, the Tyne, at the precise center of their world, was both their savior and their executioner. Bran pulled his cloak higher, the rough wool doing little to filter the soot that coated the back of his throat. He watched his youngest son, Cale, sleeping fitfully, his small chest rising too quickly, shallow gasps betraying the toxic density of the upper atmosphere within their fragile dome. This wasn't a flaw in design. It was the genius of their survival, taken too far. The Celtic builders knew that the heat must rise, but it must not escape. The thatch roof, meters deep, was kept dry and insulated by a constant, slow-moving curtain of smoke, a protective thermal barrier that clung to the inner curve of the roof timbers. This layer was supposed to sit just above head height, a ceiling of poison and warmth, leaving the lower meter of the dwelling, the living zone, relatively clear. But tonight, with the relentless frost pulling the air downwards, the smoke line had collapsed. It had dropped, a smothering inversion, pushing the deadly mixture right into the faces of the sleeping occupants. They were literally living in the suffocating shadow of their own brilliant engineering. The temperature gradient was brutal. Near the floor, where the livestock huddled, it might be a barely tolerable 5 degrees above freezing. But climb even 2 meters, and you entered the scorching, toxic heart of the structure, where invisible gases held lethal sway. They could not simply make a hole in the roof. That was the ultimate folly, the catastrophic error that would invite the full fury of the north wind and instantly negate the thermal envelope that kept them alive. Opening the single small door was equally suicidal. The ensuing draft would pull the smoke violently through the house, yes, but it would also instantly ignite the dry, carbon-coated thatch above the central fire pit, turning their sanctuary into a towering funeral pyre in seconds. Bran looked across the fire at his wife, Morwen. Her eyes were red and streaming, but resolute. They were running out of dry wood. The carefully preserved stock of oak and ash dwindling faster than the night was retreating. Forced to feed the Ain with greener, softer wood, scavenged from the ice-crusted periphery of the settlement, the fire burned sullenly. It refused to properly combust, spewing thick, oily plumes rather than the clear, hot shimmer required for safety. Each crackle of the green wood was a countdown timer to unconsciousness. Bran knew the symptoms. The dull, throbbing headache that felt like a stone pressing against his skull. The sudden, inexplicable lethargy that begged him to simply lie down and let the dark take him. The Great Chill, the relentless cold front of 1000 BCE, was not just about temperature. It was a weaponized pressure system. It pressed down on the settlement, forbidding the natural escape of their toxic waste. The cold air was so heavy, so dense. It created a gravitational blockade, trapping the smoke inside the dome like a lid pressed onto a boiling pot. Bran crept toward the perimeter wall, a structure of woven hazel and clay daub that was surprisingly robust. He pushed tentatively against the doorskin, not opening it, but subtly shifting the heavy hide that covered the aperture, creating a minute hairline fissure. A surgical error, a risk calculation made under the influence of gas and dread. He was trying to draw the lethal layer out slowly, meticulously, without initiating the deadly rush of oxygen that would set the whole structure ablaze. A tiny, wicked draft of sub-zero air shot through the gap, sharp as a knife blade, making the small flame in the hearth dance wildly for a horrifying second. The air immediately felt sharper, clearer at floor level, but the cost was instant. A visible plume of warmth rushed out, dissipating vital stored energy into the endless night. Every second of ventilation meant another minute of life, but it also meant the accelerated loss of the heat equity they had fought so hard to build up over the last terrifying hours. They were trading suffocation for hypothermia, a zero-sum game played on the razor's edge of the Bronze Age. Morwen used a long, curved stick to carefully reposition the central stones of the hearth, trying to elevate the burning wood, hoping to improve the draft by creating a tiny chimney effect within the fire pit itself. It was a futile gesture of ritual and necessity. The Roundhouse had been built to last a century, a fortress of timber and earth against time. But tonight, it felt like it would crumble before dawn. It was a magnificent, complex engine of survival, currently choking on its own exhaust. Bran closed the fissure, the immediate surge of fresh air receding, replaced by the familiar, heavy stench of despair and incomplete combustion. He knew this dance would repeat every half hour until the sun returned, if it returned at all. The smoke layer, the essential blanket, was once again creeping downwards, settling like a shroud over the children. The tightrope walk had begun again, a desperate oscillation between the need for fire to live and the certainty of fire to die. They were trapped inside a masterpiece of pre-Roman engineering, waiting for the moment when the air finally became too thin, or the spark finally became too hungry. The Roundhouse was holding them hostage, and the Bronze Age demanded a terrible sacrifice for every precious degree of warmth. The fight against the Great Chill was not fought with axes or spears, but with the careful management of invisible gases and the terrifying, relentless weight of the suffocating air, pooling their exhaustion into the final, dreadful watch of the long night. The father, Bran, watched the embers, his eyelids heavy as stone, listening not for the howl of the wolf outside, but for the silent, creeping death that lived inside their walls. Every inhalation was a calculated risk, a breath drawn from the dense, particulate-laden atmosphere that was both their shield against the Great Chill and their most insidious poison. This was the true battlefield of the Bronze Age, a war fought not with bronze axes or spears, but with the careful management of invisible gases and the terrifying, relentless weight of the suffocating air, pooling their exhaustion into the final, dreadful watch of the long night. The central hearth was not merely a fire pit. It was the sacred, throbbing heart of the family, dug deep into the earth floor, lined meticulously with river stones that now radiated a bone-deep warmth into the very foundations of the dwelling. It was here, at the epicenter of the structure, that the fragile balance was maintained, a perfect, terrifying ratio of dry oak and damp peat, designed specifically to burn slowly, steadily, producing more smoke than flame. They needed the smoke, that heavy, acrid blanket, to rise just high enough to meet the underside of the massive, cantilevered roof, where it would hover in the upper reaches, trapped by the unique architectural physics of the Roundhouse. This hovering layer This suffocating canopy of soot and heat was their crucial plenum, the engineered insulator, a dense cushion of warm air pressed against the cold exterior.
The smoke did not escape easily through a simple hole in the peak, as outsiders might imagine. No, the Celts were far too shrewd to allow their precious, hard-won heat to simply dissipate into the biting night sky. Instead, the smoke was forced to saturate the thick, tightly woven layers of thatch, driven deep into the reeds and straw, sealing the entire structure against the freezing drafts that sought to knife through the walls like icy daggers. This process, essential for warmth, simultaneously cured the thatch, rendering it waterproof and surprisingly resistant to rot, a self-sustaining marvel of primitive engineering.
But this architectural genius carried a fatal, immediate flaw. If the fire damped too quickly, or if a sudden drop in the external barometric pressure changed the dynamics near the ceiling, that dense gaseous insulation would suddenly collapse. It would fall like a curtain made of poison and lead, plunging the occupants into immediate, blinding, and often permanent suffocation. Bran knew this doom well. He had seen the glazed eyes and slack jaws of neighbors who had simply slept through the fatal descent of the smoke ceiling, victims of the very protective warmth they desperately sought. It was a trade-off that demanded absolute, ceaseless vigilance, a payment made with every ragged, shallow breath.
The hour just before dawn, the coldest, darkest, most desolate moment of the cycle, was when the risk peaked, when the Roundhouse, having held its temperature for 8 harrowing hours, began to bleed heat rapidly as the external chill reached its nadir. It was during this terrifying, fragile transition that Bran had to perform the deadly ritual of the restoke. He had to feed the fire just enough to boost the heat and push the suffocating, hovering layer back up towards the peak of the cone, reinforcing the plenum against the cold's gravitational pull. Crucially, he could not use so much fuel or stir the embers with such sudden violence that he created an unexpected updraft capable of launching a spark into the tinder dry, soot-coated thatch above. He crept forward, his lungs aching, his vision blurry from the constant low-level carbon monoxide exposure that was the unavoidable cost of staying alive inside the sealed structure. The rest of his family slept beneath layers of thick cattle hides, blissfully oblivious to the silent knife held by the atmosphere to their throats. Bran carefully lifted the peat block, its scent of damp earth and ancient decay sharp in the air. A single misplaced chunk, a moment of clumsiness driven by exhaustion, a momentary spike in the internal temperature, and the entire structure, 3 generations of labor, the accumulated safety of their clan, would become a pyre, visible for miles across the frozen landscape. The entire ceiling, dried and hardened by centuries of smoke, would erupt like a drum of pitch. But then a faint, undeniable gray light finally began to filter through the oiled leather covering the small, high window slots. These narrow apertures were not designed for light, but for controlled pressure relief. Bran signaled his eldest son, Finn,
stirring him gently from his exhaustion. This was their moment of temporary deliverance. As the external air warmed fractionally, the internal pressure changed, shifting the balance of the gases inside the chamber. Finn immediately slid open the small hatch carved near the apex of the roof, a controlled, precise release valve for the most toxic gases that had pooled at the highest point. The Roundhouse breathed out, a massive, silent sigh of toxic air rising to meet the cold morning mist outside the village perimeter. Life rushed back into the lungs of the waking family as the atmosphere cleared, revealing the internal wooden structure and the walls coated in a fine, protective layer of black soot. Proof of their successful nightly battle against the elements. The soot was their shield, the physical manifestation of the smoke-curing process that protected the massive internal wooden posts from rot and deterred the boring insects that thrived in damp wood. They had, in essence, weaponized pollution and turned the threat of fire into the tool of preservation. This daily cycle, this tightrope walk between freezing and burning, suffocation and survival, defined their entire civilization. They were master engineers of thermodynamics and gas dynamics, yet they held this mastery by the thinnest of threads, the constant, agonizing vigilance of the hearth watch. For Bran, the battle never truly ended. The clearing of the air merely marked the beginning of the heavy preparations for the next inevitable assault of the Great Chill, reminding them that the Bronze Age Celts lived not in stone castles, but in brilliant, beautiful, and terrifyingly flammable bubbles of controlled atmospheric chaos. They had bought another day, but the debt of the smoke, the invisible cost of their survival, was already mounting for the coming twilight watch. The darkness swallowed the valley outside, turning the world into a black, frozen slab. But inside the great thatched dome, the terror was illuminated only by the frantic, spitting central fire. It wasn't the cold they feared now. The Great Chill was a distant enemy banging on the door, but the true assassin was already inside, swirling silently in the elevated strata of the air they were forced to breathe. The smoke, their savior and their executioner, had reached a critical density, a toxic blanket pressing down from the eaves. Old Morwen, the village elder whose lungs had inhaled a century of wood smoke, began to cough. Not the usual phlegmy rumble, but a deep, ripping sound that tore through the relative silence of the evening meal. Every cough was a reminder of the suffocating debt they owed for the meager warmth. The genius of the Roundhouse was the chimneyless design. The rising smoke, slow and heavy from the peat and greenwood, was meant to permeate the inner layers of the thatch, drying it out and creating an insulating antibacterial layer that kept the roof intact for decades against the damp. It was a perfect system, mathematically balanced, relying on the door being opened just enough to draw in fresh, life-giving oxygen for the flame, and to allow the lightest smoke particles to vent through the tiny gaps at the apex. But tonight, the wind had shifted, a relentless downdraft pressing against the cone, refusing to let the heavy, poisonous gases escape. Every breath was a negotiation with oblivion, a biological wager against the slow accumulation of invisible death. They were living in a sealed biological flask, depending on a single narrow channel of convection to carry away the waste products of their survival. Young Phelan, always the fastest runner and the most alert hunter, felt the familiar dull throb behind his eyes, the hammer of the hearth, as the old ones called it. It wasn't pain, not yet, but a creeping, insidious lethargy that promised sleep, deep and final, a state more comforting than the brutal reality of their Bronze Age existence. They knew the signs, the ruby flush on the skin that looked like health but masked starvation of oxygen, the sudden unwarranted cheerfulness preceding the collapse, the way the world seemed to tilt into a fuzzy, comforting haze as the deadly gases took hold. This was the curse of the enclosed world, the ultimate sacrifice demanded by the gods of the flame for the temporary reprieve of warmth. The lethal beauty of the fire was its shadow. The central hearth, sunk deep into the compacted earth floor, was the nucleus of their entire existence, placed precisely in the center to distribute heat evenly across the massive 15-meter structure, ensuring the perimeter remained just warm enough to prevent frostbite on the sleeping skins. But its placement also meant that every single molecule of deadly gas had to rise directly through their breathing zone to find the only theoretical egress high above. Chirin, the firekeeper, his face slick with sweat and his eyes stinging, scrambled toward the low, woven door. The wind outside was a howling beast, threatening to rip the woven barrier from its leather hinges, but he had no choice. He needed to crack the seal, just a finger's width, to create the necessary cross-draft, a sudden rush of cold, high-pressure air that might stabilize the smoke column and push the toxic ceiling upward. A sudden influx of cold air, that blast of the great chill, could give them minutes of breathable air, extending their lives by a precarious hour. But it also risked upsetting the delicate equilibrium of the fire itself. A sudden, massive rush of oxygen could turn the smoldering, carefully banked embers into a hungry, leaping inferno, transforming the dry, smoke-impregnated thatch overhead into a towering, deadly torch in seconds, burning the whole settlement to ash. It was the ultimate gamble of the Bronze Age architect. Suffocate slowly or burn immediately. The choice was horrifyingly clear, illuminated only by the orange glow reflecting off the damp, soot-stained walls. He took a deep, agonizing breath of the thick air, steeling himself for the inevitable explosion of chaos that would follow the breaking of the seal. He pulled the latch. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. A blast of frozen wind screamed into the house, extinguishing 3 of the small animal fat oil lamps resting on the internal supporting posts, plunging large sections of the dome into absolute, choking darkness. The sudden 30-degree temperature drop was secondary to the pressure change. More importantly, the sudden shift in pressure did exactly what he feared. It created a massive, chaotic vortex above the earth. Instead of venting cleanly, the smoke column wobbled, then collapsed entirely, pushing a thick, acrid curtain of black gas down into the breathing zone. The air suddenly became heavy, tasting of burning pine and metal. Panic flared. Children screamed, their cries muffled by the toxic air. Everyone dropped low, pressing their faces against the dirt floor, where the air was coldest and marginally cleaner, clinging to the lowest centimeters of air, where the oxygen had not yet been displaced. This was the ancient drill, learned from infancy. When the house breathes ill, become earthbound. They crawled, blind and choking, toward the outer walls, where small, unintentional gaps between the wattle and daub, often used as storage nooks, offered tiny veins of clean air leaking in under the pressure differential. Siren fought his way back to the hearth, his eyes streaming, trying desperately to feed the struggling embers with smaller, drier sticks to raise the temperature and force the convection current to re-establish itself against the crushing weight of the wind.
The Roundhouse was not a passive shelter. It was a living, demanding creature that required constant, intelligent negotiation and vigilance against its own necessary functions. The fire was dying, suffocated by its own byproduct, and if the fire died, the entire village would be dead by dawn, frozen solid against the unforgiving chill that was already stealing the heat from the walls.
He finally managed to position a carefully dried piece of hazel above the embers, shielding it with his body until his skin blistered. The wood caught, hesitantly at first, then with a sudden, desperate roar of renewed life. The heat surged, and with it, the smoke column finally straightened, snapping back into its vertical trajectory like a drawn bowstring released. The deadly ceiling of gas lifted, rising away from their desperate faces. Just enough.
They gasped, drawing ragged, painful breaths, their lungs stinging with the lingering poison. They were saved, for the second time that hour, by a razor's edge of physics and luck. But the night was young, and the smoke, the eternal shadow cast by the fire of their survival, was already gathering its strength for the next deadly siege. It was a debt they would pay every hour until the sun returned to the Celtic hills.
The debt was paid in carbon and fear, and in the agonizing realization that every inhalation inside the great roundhouse was a gamble against invisible death. The structure itself was no longer just wood and wattle. It was a pressurized, breathing dome, forcing the occupants into a terrifying, intimate communion with the smoke that saved them. This was the moment the Bronze Age sun dipped below the horizon, and the true rulers of the ancient world, the Sea, the relentless spirits of the deep cold, came knocking, demanding their tribute. The hearth, burning low and stable in the center, was not merely a source of warmth. It was the single, erratic, beating heart of the structure, simultaneously their savior and their potential executioner. It was an engineering paradox wrapped in a biological nightmare, and the Celts lived entirely within its grasp. But the true genius and the true horror of the roundhouse lay not in the fire, but in the ceiling. The conical thatch, woven dense and thick over the radiating rafters, was meticulously designed not to release the smoke cleanly, but to hold it captive, to create a permanent, heavy layer just below the apex. Think of modern chimneys built for efficiency. The Celtic roundhouse was purpose-built to contain the toxic air. Why such madness? because the smoke, heavy with volatile organic compounds and soot particulates, was their primary shield against structural decay and lethal cold. It was a hydrophobic barrier, coating the underside of the thatch and preventing condensation, that insidious, freezing dampness from setting in and rotting the entire roof over the long, unforgiving winter. This process created the critical thermal layer, the smoky blanket that sealed the living space. It was a radiant heater that worked by chemical means, keeping the floor space just above survivable freezing levels, but at a cost that measured in vital capacity. The smoke was their friend until it became the ultimate enemy. The chemical equation of survival was terrifyingly simple. Warmth equals increasing concentration of carbon monoxide. The Celtic architect, an unnamed genius operating on instinct and generations of terrifying trial and error, understood this critical balance intuitively. The floor of the roundhouse was often slightly sunken, digging the living space down into the Earth's insulating embrace, leveraging geothermal stability. But this low level had an additional, terrifying side effect. It kept the deadliest, invisible threat, carbon monoxide, pooled just above the sleeping platforms, waiting. CO is a silent killer, subtly less dense than warm air, but in the specific low-draft heat dynamics of the roundhouse, especially when the fire was banked low for the night, it formed insidious, invisible clouds that clung to the upper layers of the sleeping space. A slight headache, a creeping wave of nausea, the inability to stir from a deep sleep, these were the whispered warnings of the silent hunter. The families learned to sleep low, almost directly on the packed earth, where the freshest, heaviest oxygen-rich air lingered. But even this was a momentary postponement against a gas that respects no walls, only pressure and diffusion. The entire burden of managing this chemical tightrope fell upon the shoulders of the fire tender. This was the single most critical, sleepless sentinel in the entire clan. Their task was the continuous titration of life and death, the meticulous measurement of fuel versus oxygen consumption. Too much wood, and the blaze would roar, rapidly consuming all available air, sending lethal concentrations of CO down into the sleeping zone, and worst of all, risking the immediate ignition of the dry, seasoned, smoke-caked thatch above. The fire alarm of 1000 BCE was not a shout. It was the sudden, catastrophic collapse of the ceiling onto the sleeping family. Too little wood, and the embers would settle too far. The crucial smoke blanket would thin, and the chilling damp would begin its relentless invasion, sinking the temperature below survivable levels before the gray light of dawn. The fire tender lived in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, smelling the air for the acrid edge of insufficient oxygen, watching the subtle serpentine movement of the smoke column that twisted toward the roof aperture. That aperture was not a chimney, but a relief valve, often just a small opening, sometimes capped by a movable wicker shield that could be adjusted with a long pole. Managing its opening and closing in the howling wind and slicing rain was an art form passed down through generations of terrified necessity.
They were masters of microclimate management, manipulating the draft by controlling the single doorway, often covered by heavy insulated hide, and the small critical smoke hole above. Every breath taken, every single log added to the glowing embers was a calculated risk against catastrophic failure. The outside world was a realm of instant frostbite and ravenous predators, but the inside world was a fragile, human-made bubble, sustained by controlled, agonizing suffocation. As the long hours dragged toward the absolute minimum temperature that occurs just before sunrise, the fire tender's vigilance became desperate, absolute. The roundhouse walls groaned under the crushing pressure of the external cold, and the air thickened, heavy with the sweet scent of pine smoke and the faint, metallic tang of impending, unseen doom.
The debt was being paid hourly, not with gold or bronze, but with the steady, irreversible erosion of their vital capacity. They were trading minutes of warmth for drops of poison, praying the poison would not collect enough strength to claim them before the first light broke over the brutal Celtic hills. The siege was ongoing, and the deadliest enemy was not the climate, but the weapon they were forced to wield against it. Surviving the night was the true, agonizing miracle.